Netcasting from Chicago, Los Angeles, and Sydney. You're listening to this week's FX Podcast from fxguide.com.
This podcast is proudly brought to you by Colorfront. Colorfront's leading onset dailies and express dailies systems deliver integrated production-proven dailies tools with state-of-the-art color and image science, leading camera raw support, and simultaneous faster than real-time deliveries in all common file formats. Visit colorfront.com.
Thanks for joining us for this FX Podcast. The FX Podcast is where we talk one-on-one with top visual effects artists doing cutting-edge work. We dig deep into the technical side, advance the craft of visual effects, and pay respect to the hardworking people creating amazing work. This podcast is your opportunity to hear directly from the source, from the front lines of visual effects. Be sure to check out our other podcasts at fxguide.com/podcasts. This is Jeff User, and joining me on the line is Mike Seymour. Mike, how are you, my friend?
Good, sir. How are you?
Good. So I'm excited about this podcast because I have turned many people on to the Dr. Alvy Ray Smith podcast, and both online and in person, just in talking about it. And everyone who I've turned it on to has come back to me and said, thank you, that was amazing. I've seen people mentioning online that they've listened to it more than once. And you mentioned in that podcast that you wanted to talk to Jim Blinn. And here we are.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, at the risk of sounding completely sycophantic and gushing, talking to these guys is just awesome. And Jim Blinn is certainly very high on a list of people in my life I hoped one day I would talk to. I actually let you in on a little secret, Jeff. When I first was hiring at a company doing computer graphics, we were actually writing ray tracers back in the day. And I was just one of the panel of your sort of various interviews you had to get through. When you got to mine, one of the questions I asked people was, did they know who Jim Blinn was? Because it gave me a really good reading straight away, whether they read research papers or not. If they didn't know who Jim Blinn was, well, it's pretty likely that they weren't somebody that we wanted to have on the team, because he was so instrumental in so much stuff, and not least of which is he invented bump mapping, helped invent environment mapping. There are so many shaders that are just directly result from him. But yet, and I know this is really going to resonate with you, he devoted much of his life to helping with space exploration, which I know is something that you really care a lot about.
Yes, I enjoyed that part of the interview, talking about the JPL time and the simulations and the loving care that went into the simulations. Let's just run down a few of the things. And there's a story online that people should check out that goes along with this podcast with a lot of examples and more stories that even fit in the podcast. I mean, probably the thing for me that stood out was when I started listening to the podcast, I realized that, we all know Moore's law, the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubles approximately every 2 years or 18 months, depending on who you listen to. But then there's Blinn's law, which I knew of, but I didn't put two and two together. I knew that it was called that. And that is, as technology advances, rendering time remains constant, which I think anybody who's worked in production certainly understands that we get bigger, better, faster machines, the render farm doubles, and yet everything still takes the same amount of time because we just make things more complicated.
The great thing about that is it would be wrong to think that Jim Blinn is somebody who is an academic or somebody that was just interested in research. The very fact that his law pertains to what it's like in production, I think, is just one of the most illuminating aspects. I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a guy who devoted his life to helping bridge between those who are writing and developing and, coming up with the algorithms and those that were actually working. And he himself was very much, though this may sound weird, he was very much into production. But the production that he was mainly involved in was that of, after he'd become incredibly well-known and published immensely, he devoted a lot of his time to producing educational animations to explain the concepts of physics and maths as a kind of a passion piece. And he says in the interview that this was the project he was born to do. And that may sound like a weird thing, but I've got to say, this is somebody that could have ended up with multiple Academy Awards, could have done whatever, but he thought it was really important to help educate and spread the word and, make life sort of easier for people. So even though the guy clearly, as he talks about in the podcast, can, if you need to, get into spherical trigonometry, he's also just a really down-to-earth guy who just wants people to love computer graphics and produce cool imagery. He's a great guy.
Yeah, I mean, people really, again, I'll say it again, check out the story because there's stuff that is not in there. Like, for example, the teapot stuff, the story about the famous teapot that we all know and love and see demonstrated in every 3D demo since the beginning of time.
Yeah, I've got to say, the imagery on there, just so if I can just sort of point this out to some people, I have known some of Jim's imagery, in particular as a strawberry, which was pivotal in his paper in SIDGraph for explaining bump mapping. Never seen it reproduced this well. I showed him what I had seen, and I'd seen it in Foley Van Dam and a bunch of textbooks over the years, umpteen times. I've seen it in PDFs and on the web, and he was like, oh, no, that's like third generation. I'll get you an original. And so a lot of these images you're seeing in a quality I've not seen in my entire life. Like, seriously, the shots of Saturn and stuff, I'd seen them when they'd come off a 1-inch machine. He went back to the original digital files for this story. So it's not just, you might think, well, yeah, obviously I know his work because he's so famous. But with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 images, most of these images are at a quality level I've just never seen before. So it's just great.
Yeah, and the amount of things that he's touched that we use every day, or, that as, growing up watching all the space missions and things and seeing simulations that he had done that, of course, the networks were starving for imagery for anything like that. Just showing them over and over again. And, it's just everything about what we do right now. These two guys, this series of podcasts you're doing, I just love. So kudos.
Thanks. We were calling it the Founder Series. So we hopefully to do more of them. And I've got to say, when we published the Alvarez email, a lot of people went, okay, so when are you going to talk to Jim Blinn? And I was like, because Jim isn't actually...
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
But he's actually kind of hard to get to. He actually now got a website, which we've got in the story. But after he left Microsoft, he was not an easy guy to get hold of. But we did, and he was incredibly generous with his time.
I got a kick out of the mention in this podcast about punch cards, and you guys having to explain what punch cards was. When I was growing up, my dad ran the IBM 360 computer lab at Shenley Distillers in Kentucky. And I used to go play chess with punch cards against the big mainframe.
Wow. Where
you'd literally type the move in on a punch card. And so I was very familiar with them. And in fact, I'm always fascinated by the fact that, just at that one place, he worked at 2 places in the area that had IBM 360s. And, there were rooms full of people that punch carded. There were just, rows after rows of these punch card machines. And they weren't small. And they're all, where are they? They're all gone. They're all, I guess, destroyed.
Yes. I tweeted this week that, just as an aside, there's a Pixar image computer up for sale on eBay for
I saw
$15,000.
I saw that. We've got to get you up. When I was up in San Francisco a few years back, I went to the museum up there in just outside of San Francisco, the Computer Museum, and they had basically one of everything. They've got Crays and IBM 360s and punch card machines and boxed copies of Mosaic and Mozilla. Apple, products from every generation. Looked like if I had kept everything over the years, everything I've ever owned in that regard. But anyway, yeah, that'd be a cool place to visit if you're ever up that way next time.
Yes. Well, I do tend to find my way up to Northern California.
Yeah, you do. So what else have you been doing? You've been, the new term's going well over at PhD, I assume,
It's
fxPhD?
Going very well. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that as well, because I wanted to just do a plug, if I can, for... If you are a member of fxPhD, and I know a lot of people that listen to this podcast are, if you tell a friend about PhD and they're not a member of PhD, if you get them to sign up, they can actually put your username in at the time that they join. It has to be the time they join. And within about 7 days, we'll give you a full course credit. So in other words, if you were doing some courses and you got a mate to join PhD, if they put your username in under the referring member part of their sign-up thing, you'll get an entire bonus course free. And you know what? Not just one. Get 5 people to sign up. We'll give you 5 courses. So
that's if you're a member and you get somebody else to join. That's the way that works.
Yeah. So and if you're about to join and you have a friend who's a member, then feel free to put their name on. I'm not going to get medieval on you as to who did what, but obviously we do it as a way of encouraging you to suggest PhD to other people, but you have to do it at the time that you join up, because otherwise, honestly, we get people emailing us, go, somebody joined up 2 years ago that said that they were going to put my name down and they forgot, and can we get a free? It's like, sorry, I can't really do that.
Right.
But yes, at
Well,
the
that's
time
great.
it's the time you place the order, and if you are a PhD member, just go into the student union part of the forums, into the student news and information section. You'll see John has the details there if you're any doubt as to what to do. But it's pretty simple. Just at the point at which they sign up, there's a place to put a promotional code, which I think we've only ever had one or two of, very rare. And then there's a referring member bit. Just got to put their username in PhD in there.
Right, right. And SIGGRAPH obviously coming up soon, so all this kind of
yes.
ties in nicely to that too, because these guys have been very active in SIGGRAPH over the years.
Yeah, Jim Blinn has been a legend in SIGGRAPH, and I think he's been to every one of them. I actually worked it out the other day. SIGGRAPH this year is our 38th SIGGRAPH. I did the maths because the first one was in 74 in Boulder, Colorado. So in 2014, it'll be the 40th anniversary. So this is our 38th SIGGRAPH. And Jim Blinn was going from 74. I think he got his in bachelor in like 70, and 78 he got his PhD. At the University of Utah, but he was doing computer graphics back at University of Michigan. So yeah, because in 76 he published reflectance mapping or environment mapping, and then he worked out, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had things as faceted objects in terms of modeling in 77, and then published bump map in 78. And he was doing the flybys in 79. And then went up to Lucasfilm briefly, and then came back, as you'll hear in the story, because JPL basically said, whatever it takes to keep you here, we'll do it. And of course, his demands weren't money. It was buy me a better computer and a better graphics card. So,
Yeah. You know, that the whole one of the things I meant to mention after the Alvy Ray Smith podcast is the relationship of and this kind of ties into that museum I was talking about, because that area up there was such a hotbed of activity and still is. But Alvy Ray Smith mentioned Junaid Sheikh at Ampex at the time, who of course went on to do Abacus and ACOM and, you know, a bunch of products there. And a lot of people in the business know him over the years. The history of those, you know, the people working on these products and how intertwined they were, or how their paths kind of crossed in and out, is fascinating to me.
Oh yeah, because, you know, let's not forget that we're also talking about Jim Clark, who would go on to become SGI and Netscape, and he was University of Utah, I'm pretty sure. And
yes.
I mean, actually he was at Evans and Sutherland now, and Evans and Sutherland was also home to John Warnock, who went on to become Adobe, and a bunch of those guys also were at Xerox PARC, which of course led into a lot of stuff happening at Apple. There's just tons of stuff all interrelated there. Though, maybe as an American you can answer me this: why Utah? Why was the University of Utah the center of the universe? I've not actually had anyone adequately explain that to me.
I don't know. I would almost have to guess at that time there must have been some. Would it be military? I mean, I'm just guessing.
I mean, I have nothing against Utah. I think Utah is probably a really, really great place, and I certainly don't, you know, for a second want to sound like it shouldn't be at Utah. It's just that it seems to me that Utah is awesome, just not, you know, New York or LA or San Francisco or just any one of a countless number of sort of, you know, I'm sure it's terrific. I think it's a really great place. But I just always would have thought, you know, because today you'd be thinking, you know, I guess you could argue the same thing about Microsoft up in Seattle, or you know,
or 3M and Xerox being in Minnesota.
Yeah, but the University of Utah, center of the friggin' universe when it came to the history of our industry.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get there one day. Apparently, it's a gorgeous place. Anyway, we should get into the interview.
All right, so Mike, why don't we just jump into the interview here? You obviously talked with Dr. James Blinn.
Thank you so much for joining us, because it's a great honor to have you to talk to. I was going to see if I could jump way back to the University of Utah, where you got your PhD in 78. And of course, that must have been where you met Ivan Sutherland. I was wondering, what was it like back then in 78? Because when you started your bachelor's degree, there wasn't even a computer science degree to be offered, right? It was just you did physics and communication for your bachelor's.
That was at the University of Michigan, where actually I did a lot of stuff before going to Utah. They didn't have a computer science department at the time, but they had something called communication science, or something like that. But I started out in physics, and I was able to get actually a double major in physics and communication science, as I called it.
So you get to Utah and it is now computer science, and Utah University has such a central role in the evolution and history of computer graphics. Was it an exciting time back then, or did you feel like it was more of a corner of the industry? I mean, looking back, it was the center of the universe.
Well, certainly it was exciting, and I feel like I kind of got there at the optimal time for me anyway. I got there at about the same time that they bought their first ENS picture system, which was a 3D line drawing hardware that did 3D rotations and stuff in real time, and about the same time as they got the first frame buffer going. Before then, they had done a lot of research in rendering, but it was all kind of offline in the sense they had to like take a time exposure or a TV screen in order to get an image out. And so I got there at the time when we were first able to see the image, on a frame buffer as it was produced. And also, the funding for the main computer graphics research was starting to shrink, and so I was able to kind of get there when the good equipment was and get finished before the funding disappeared.
Now, I'm right in saying Ivan Sutherland was central at Utah before he moved to Caltech and, of course, became involved in JPL. And can you tell me what it was like? Because Ivan Sutherland is such a legend for, obviously, Evans and Sutherland and the role that they played. JPL, started around 77. So this is all happening around the time that you're finishing your PhD.
Yeah, Ivan had left Utah just before I got there, so I didn't interact with him at that time. Although there was he actually called back, I guess, to Martin Newell, asking for somebody to help him make a test image for a presentation he was making, and so I did that for him while I was a graduate student, remotely. He was he was in California. I think he was not at Caltech yet. He was at forget the name of the research institute out on the coast. Anyway, so I sort of got roughly acquainted with him by then. And when I graduated from Utah, he had just started his tenure at Caltech, and so I called him up and said, "Hi, I'm interested in maybe joining your department at Caltech, but to be honest with you, what I'm really interested in is JPL, because JPL is run by Caltech, and I was interested in the space exploration side of things." And so he said, "Well, that's interesting because some guy at JPL had just gotten a set of equipment that was a duplicate of what was going on at Utah. And so he's looking for somebody to run it. And so you can come out and become a postdoc at Caltech and teach a course, and then spend half your time there and half time at JPL doing stuff with this new equipment."
So I'm right that JPL had only just started. When did you first hear of JPL? Because we, of course, link you very closely with JPL, but when did you first hear of the?
It was 1977, June or July, beginning of July 1977.
And you went there at that stage. Did you know that, or was there any discussion about being involved in the flyby simulations, or was that to come later?
It happened very early on. I'm not sure if I knew that beforehand, but fairly shortly after I got there, I got hooked up with a guy named Charlie Colhase, who was the project manager of the Voyager project, and he had actually made a computer-animated movie of the Voyager flyby a couple years earlier when they were demonstrating the mission. It was a black and white line drawing made with a film plotter with another guy named Paul Penzo. And so I saw that film, and then I saw we had the ENS picture system, which could do that in real time. And we had the frame buffer, which I had been doing research in textured surfaces. And so, it was just kind of fell in my lap that this is the obvious thing I must do now, is to make a shaded image version of this movie with texture mapping on the surface of the planet.
It was at a time when computer graphics was so young that, am I not right in saying that for many people who started to see those JPL flybys in the popular press, in the news and stuff, many people really actually thought that they were actual footage because, of course, the news organisations didn't really have much to run with. So your material got heavily used in the popular press, didn't it?
Well, it was shown on the TV stations as part of their news broadcast, and I guess a lot of people didn't quite know where it came from. There was a story I heard that there were two Voyager spacecraft that went out to Jupiter and Saturn, and they got there about 6 or 8 months apart. But for people who didn't know that, some people actually thought that the movie was made by one of the spacecraft watching the other one go by.
It's hard to imagine now because everyone seems to be so technically literate. But back then, this was so revolutionary and so new, and for many people, they would have characterized that footage as photoreal because this really was the sort of the state of the art. Let me ask you this: the period that you're at JPL and when you're doing this work, how hard was it to be accurate? Because you're working in an environment where a lot of people would have cared a lot about the accuracy of the work that you were doing. It's not like a film where if it looks good, it's valid. Was there a lot of debate on the accuracy of your material?
Well, not in the sense that anybody asked me to make it accurate, because I made it accurate on my own, under my own steam, basically. The thing to realize about the Voyager flyby animations is JPL never actually requested me to do this.
Oh, really?
I was the equipment that I used was a duplicate of what was at Utah at the time, and it was purchased kind of with funds left over at the end of the fiscal year by a guy who thought that'd be cool to do computer graphics, but wasn't sure exactly what could be done with it, and so there was no official project to do this animation, and it was completely a kind of like a backroom sort of thing. Charlie Colhase, I say, was a mission planner for Voyager, and so he knew the details of what was going to happen when, and he thought it was be really cool to make the movie. And so I spent a lot of my time making it as accurate as I could, and in fact, it was in some sense easy to do because the laws of motion and the physics and the geometry and so forth were quite well known and well established. But the planetary surfaces early on, we used a paint program to draw artist impressions of what we thought they looked like. But later on, we were able to use actual photographs to make more accurate views of the textures. But when I made the movie, JPL, in a certain sense, didn't know what to do with it. The head of the public information office didn't even realize we were doing it, and wasn't sure, what to do with it. And it just happened that Charlie was going back to NASA headquarters to fill in the NASA head administrator on the upcoming flyby. What was going to happen, and what to expect to present to the press and so forth. And he brought along this film and said, "Oh, by the way, here, take a look at this film." And the head of NASA said, "Hey, this is great. Let's make a whole bunch of copies of this film and use that as a part of our press kit." And the public information office kind of felt like they'd been, short-circuited, I guess, at that point. So anyway, we made a bunch of. Actually, the story was they said, send us the negative of the film, and we'll make the copies here and send them out. So we sent them the negative of the film, and for some reason or other, they lost the negative. So I had to make another run of the program to make another negative. We made our own copies, and so once the first Voyager by Jupiter happened, we kind of established that there were cool movies to be made, and so after that, there was a new one expected to be made for every mission after that.
I want to talk about your research in this period of the late 70s. The first SIGGRAPH ever was 74. I think in 76, was it, that you presented your work on reflectance and environment mapping? Is that, have I got my timeline right?
Right, yeah.
So environment mapping, I'm sorry, but like that and bump mapping, they just seem so fundamental to my understanding of computer graphics these days. It's hard to imagine a time before they existed. Do you want to give me some of the background on how you did first environment mapping and then A year or two later, I think you presented your paper on bump mapping. I'd love to hear the story of how that came to be.
Environment mapping was actually primarily Martin Newell's idea. He was my thesis advisor at Utah, and we were teaching the computer graphics course at Utah at the time. He was a professor there, and I was a teaching fellow, and so we spent a lot of time talking about rendering and geometry and so forth, preparing for the lectures. And I think we taught each other more than we taught the students, in the sense that his background and my background kind of meshed in terms of I knew stuff he didn't, and he knew stuff I didn't. And so he kind of came in one day, and he said, he was just thinking, this morning while he was taking a shower, that what if you were to take, the calculation for the lighting, and instead of doing the regular dot product with the light source that give you the color of the surface, what if you took the light and kind of reflected it backwards, kind of like a mirror reflection, and you could project that, off to infinity and look that up in a map to find out what would be reflected in that particular spot. And I thought, hey, that sounds really neat. And I worked out the actual geometry, the math for it, which was pretty simple. And I already had a program that would render things, so I just was able to slap this in as a replacement for the rendering thing. And presto, we got reflections on the surface of the teapot.
In fact, in 74, you'd written a paint program, hadn't you? So you could even paint those reflections.
Yeah, well, actually, that's how we did the first reflections. We just kind of painted some sort of smeary-looking window-like thing on there just to kind of see if it worked. And so that's where reflection mapping, the first reflection mapping came from. It was helpful having the frame buffer there because we could, see the images as they were produced, and using a paint program to generate data and so forth. So that was very convenient. It would have been harder to do if we had to do the old technique of taking time exposures off the CRT and so forth.
And those,
I had this program that was kind of a test bed for rendering things that I could slip in different functions for the calculation of the intensity pretty easily.
Yes. And so that's in that paper you deliver in 76. In 77, I think you come back with the idea of surface facets. Is that right?
Bump mapping? Are you talking bump mapping?
Well, even before that, I think it was bump mapping.
I spent a lot of time poking around in the engineering library, trying to figure out better reflection models. Best one at the time when I got there was by Buitong Fong, who came up with a calculation of how light reflects off surfaces, simulation of that so that you could get highlights as well as diffuse reflection. And it was mostly, the function was constructed to simulate roughly how they knew it worked, but it wasn't based on any very complex physical simulation. And so I poked around in the engineering library, and I stumbled across something called the Journal of the Illumination Engineering Society. And in 1920, they had an article where somebody had actually measured, how much light is reflected off of a surface in all the different directions given light hitting it from the surface, and with these kind of circular diagrams with a lump sticking out, which was the specular reflection portion.
This has to be the original BRDF then.
Well, it was certainly an early one. It's hard to say original. I mean, there's always precursors to everything you see. And so the first one, it was the earliest one I came across, and I thought, this is really cool. Let me try to just digitize this data to, just make a table out of it so I could do, a lookup to emulate this function. Unfortunately, digitizing pictures was not easy to do in those days. And so I spent some time with Xerox machines and trying to blow up the pictures big enough so I could see them, so forth. But meanwhile, I was poking around looking at lots of other articles, and I started finding more and more recent articles that actually had a physical model behind them, and came up with an article by a guy named Torrance and a guy named Sparrow from Minnesota, who had the model of microfacets on the surface and the statistical effect they had on reflection. And their calculation was kind of horrendous to do because it used spherical trigonometry and a whole bunch of other geometrical things that would be difficult to calculate. So I spent weeks and weeks with trigonometric identities and so forth, trying to figure a simple way of doing it, and finally figured out, redrived it in a way that made it much more simple to calculate. And so I was able to stick that in as the Torrance Sparrow reflection model for how highlights and more accurate versions of highlights on surfaces.
And so from there, the next step is bump mapping, which I think you published the following year in 78, which was just remarkable. I mean, it's
that was pretty cool. I was really happy with that. that was generated originally because my interest has always been in science visualization, I guess you call it nowadays. That is, making pictures of various scientific things, and I was trying to make a picture of a water molecule, and two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen, in the proper relative sizes and so forth. And that's been made before. But I was trying to see, suppose I could make a texture for the surface on this thing. Atoms, typically portrayed as fuzzy blobs or clouds of electrons floating around and so forth. So anything you do with a making a picture of an atom is somewhat metaphorical. But I thought, how could I make this using texture mapping look like sort of like a ball of yarn, which was effectively the visualization of the trails of the electron as they're whizzing around really fast. So I tried various drawings, various textures to do this, trying to make it look like a fuzzy ball of yarn. And they all looked too solid surface because it looked like a shiny formica surface with some streaks on the surface of it. And so I was kind of staring at that and said, why is this not looking bumpy? And I was kind of looking at my shoes at the time, and the shoes I was wearing had, they were made of leather, but they actually had an embossed pattern in the surface. And I was looking at the highlights on them and realized, what's making this thing look bumpy is not the actual displacement, how far the surface is displaced, but it's the fact that it changes the angle of the surface from one place to the next. So I said, how about if I was able to take and make a texture that indicated how to nudge the surface normal from one spot to the next in order to, and then plug that into the regular lighting equation. That would be a good approximation to it. And so after a bunch of bashing around with that, I came up with the equation right when the frame buffer broke. The frame buffer at Utah was the prototype, basically one that ENS made, and it was wire wrapped, and it basically, the connections on it were kind of flaky, and so it's not working.
Any wire wrapped board was pretty dodgy at the best of times.
And so that was actually the year after I had gone to New York Tech, and so that Christmas, I guess it was, I flew out to New York Tech during Christmas break to use their frame buffer to try out the idea, because I didn't know for sure, if it would work, because our frame buffer was broken. And so we did a really simple thing where we took a texture pattern and just used the brightness of that to nudge the x coordinate of the normal a little bit, and looked promising enough. So when I went back to Utah and they finally fixed the frame buffer, then I was able to do the thing right. It's one of those things that's tricky to debug, because if you get a sign wrong, you can look at the picture and it looks okay, kind of, but it looks weird. And so I was able to use the programmability of the frame buffer to do a quickie animation. The frame buffer was microprogrammed so that it would either scan out 512 by 512 pixels as the highest resolution, or you can program it to scan out a 64 by 64 subsquare. And so you had 16 of those things, and you could have it cycle between which of those 16 it was going to show from one frame to the next. So I was able to make a little 16-frame movie of a sphere texture map rotating. And that's the trick to make sure that the thing is actually working right. And, of course, the first time I had a sign wrong, and so you look at the thing rotating, it just didn't look like a real thing somehow. It was just kind of weird optical illusion. So once I fixed the sign and got the thing rotating, then I had this bumpy rotating sphere before me, and I was really actually literally dancing around in the room when I saw how cool it was.
And so this is just at the beginning of 32-bit frame buffers, or what we think of as a full color frame buffer.
Oh, hell no! This is an 8-bit frame buffer.
Oh, it's still an 8-bit frame buffer. Because NYIT did have a full color frame buffer, but they obviously started with 8-bit.
Not at that time. I think it was the next year they got it, but that was them. That wasn't me.
So you're literally sitting around looking at what, a pair of black or brown shoes, and this is the basis of bump mapping.
Yeah, right.
You still got the shoes?
I'm not. No, I don't. I think I might have left them behind at Utah. Somebody said that they found a pair of my shoes at Utah when I left because I don't know if you've lived in where there's a lot of snow, but what typically happens is you have a pair of shoes at home and a pair of shoes at work, and you have a pair of boots that you wear from one to the next place. And you get to the place and you take off boots, put on whatever shoes you've got at that location. And so those pair of shoes kind of stayed at my office actually by accident when I finally left Utah.
Now, 79 is the flybys that we were talking about earlier, but did you also get involved with Xerox PARC at all around this time, or not?
Not really. My contact with Xerox PARC was a little sporadic. We were kind of starting my career talking about Utah, which in fact was not nearly the beginning of my career in computer graphics. I was doing computer graphics at the University of Michigan for about 6 or 7 years beforehand. When I was just the last year or so, I was at Michigan. I went out to visit a friend in California who was working someplace else, but it was near Xerox PARC, and I kind of called up William Newman at Xerox PARC to see if I could come and give a tour. And he wasn't available, basically, and so I was kind of at the front door of Xerox PARC, but nobody was there who knew who I was because I wasn't, well known at all at the time. So I just kind of saw the building, and then I went back to Michigan and did some more stuff. When I was at Utah, Martin Newell, my thesis advisor, had been a professor there for about 2 years, but he decided he was going to leave and go to Xerox PARC to be a researcher there. And so I had to finish up my thesis really quick before he left. So he went out to Xerox PARC, so I had contact with him, and he and I had talked about writing a textbook. And so I came out and visited him a couple times there and used the Altos where we tried writing a draft of the textbook, but we really didn't get very far into it. So I was there kind of as a visitor briefly. And when I finished at Utah, I was interested in going to work at JPL, but I also interviewed at Xerox PARC. And, they were, interested in me, but I was really much more committed to space exploration than what Xerox was doing at the time. So I decided to go to JPL.
Did you meet Dr. Ed Catmull at Xerox PARC, or was that at NYIT?
Catmull, I don't think was ever at Xerox PARC either.
I'm sorry, I meant Dr. Albie Ray Smith. My apologies.
No, he was. The first time I met him was at New York Tech in the summer of 1976, where I was basically there as an intern, what would be called nowadays an intern, summer job, to go out and do some stuff with their thing. And so he was there with 4 or 5 other people. It was fairly early on in their project. Yeah, I actually ran into Ed briefly at Utah as he was leaving and I was arriving. I was out there just as a visit just before I was there, and he was there just finishing up talking to Martin Newell, and I was introduced to him at the time. But when he was running the graphics program at New York Tech is when I, got to know him better, and that's when I met Albie for the first time.
And did you ever just...
Albie was a really fun guy because he knew he had lived in New York for a while, and so he kind of knew where all the fun things were to do. And so, we all piled in his car on weekends and went off to movies together in New York, or went to lectures. There was a lecture series on the history of animation that we all went to.
I think you even briefly went up to Lucasfilm, didn't you, or sort of?
Yeah, well, that was somewhat later. When I was at JPL, we did the Voyager flybys, and we did the Cosmos animations for Carl Sagan's Cosmos project. And it's about the time that Ed and Albie was starting the project at Lucasfilm. And we had this 8-bit frame buffer at JPL, and it was getting really constraining how much I could do visually with that, because you couldn't do full color, and it was just a PDP-11, which was kind of a small machine for doing stuff. And they're getting all this neat equipment at Lucasfilm, and so I finally decided maybe I owed it to myself to go someplace where graphics had more, better equipment. And so I called up Ed and asked him if he, had a place for me at Lucasfilm, and he said, "Great, yeah, come on up and join us." It's about 1981, maybe. And it turned out, in fact, that when I announced to JPL that I was leaving to go to work at Lucasfilm, the director of JPL very kindly found that I had, felt that I had something that, JPL wanted. And so he asked me, what would it take to keep me at JPL? And I said, well, I need a decent frame buffer and a decent computer, because what I'm using is too small. And so he actually told me he would spend his, yearly director's discretionary fund to buy me a new frame buffer and a computer. And so here I was, and I felt like I was sort of committed to Ed at the time, but still, JPL had this attractive thing. And so I was kind of basically half-time both places for about 6 months. And because I wanted to, fulfill, my promise to come and work with Ed. So Ed and I actually, during that time, we co-taught a course at Berkeley in computer graphics, but I was basically commuting back and forth between LA and San Francisco once a week for that period of time. Finally, I realized, my heart was really in the space exploration, and besides which, Saturn was coming up, and there was all these cool data coming in for Saturn. If I stayed at JPL, I could make cool movies of Saturn, and I just, I couldn't pass that up. So I decided to thank Ed for his generosity, but I needed to go back to my home at JPL.
I wanted to discuss the Cosmos series, but in the broader context, that a big thread of your entire career, if I could suggest it, has just been the role of educator, and not only educator, but sort of scientific educator of a nature that's still accurate but accessible to the public. I mean, the Voyager stuff was accessible and illuminated so many people, but then there's the mechanical universe, the Carl Sagan Cosmos series, and then also the mathematics, or the Project Mathematics, or the Mathematica, I think it started as being called. This love of education then goes into SIGGRAPH as well, and spreading the knowledge. But I was wondering if we could talk about a couple of these educational projects, especially starting with the mechanical universe. You did an astonishing amount of work for that 52 half-hour series, 500 sort of animations, is that right?
Yeah, there was almost 8 hours total running time on this thing. It was like the pinnacle of my career in that sense. It was a project that I was born to do, and I've been thinking about that since then, and it's been amazing how that came about, because I'm in fact in the process of writing some autobiographical descriptions of my adventures along the way to get there. But when I was very young, there were a couple of films that I saw that inspired me. One of them was called Man in Space. It was a Disney film about space exploration, and I was a big fan of Disney animation at the time, and also a big fan of space exploration. But what struck me about it was how cool it was that they could use animation to teach people how the human body reacts to space and what it would take to make space travel possible. So this is kind of like in the back of my mind from very early on. And all the decisions that I made about where to go to school and what to do when I was at school and so forth somehow kind of magically conspired to give me the proper experience and the background to be able to do the Mechanical Universe project, because it was very complex and I had to know a lot of different things, and I happened to have had the proper experience to do it. And it was just terrific, but it was pretty grueling, because it was basically 7 years, 7 days a week, working around the clock, and just slowly, one at a time, ticking off each animation. And fortunately, the project was run by a physics professor at Caltech, who I became pretty close to in the process of doing the thing. We would meet actually every day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And it was my promise to myself that I would have something new to show him every day. And I did, and we looked at storyboards, we figured out animations together, and I showed him, various ideas for things, and it was just this all total focus to get this project going. And I'm really glad that I was able to be in the right place at the right time to make that work, because it was pretty stunning.
Tell me, how did you make them? I mean, these drawings, or rather animations, which were so instructional, obviously from a communications point of view, you had the physics degree, the communications degree, and obviously the computer science. But hands on deck, how were you actually doing it? What was the sort of program, or how did you program it to be done?
Well, it was all home-built software that I put together over the years, and fine-tuned for that particular project. We had a VAX 11780 computer, which was the one that the head of JPL had gotten for me, and we had an RGB frame buffer that we put together, and we got a 1-inch Type C videotape machine that I was able to figure out the engineering to do that and have that controlled by the computer. So basically, I had an animation program that put together line drawings on the screen, and I would set up keyframes for the different positions and angles for things, and take the script of the animation and kind of time out how much time I wanted to go from one spot to the next. And then when I got that to look right as a line drawing, then I would set it up to issue the data from each frame to a series of rendering programs that would render. I had, various 2 and 3D rendering programs that I had put together to do the rendering, and set that up in a loop to render a frame, save it to disk, render the next frame, save it to disk. Very similar to, I guess, how things are done nowadays. And then I had a recording program that would take, you give a copy of the script in a sense of which frame to put on the screen for how long, and it would go through and haul the frames off the disk, signal a tape machine to record the frame, pull the next frame off the disk, signal a tape to record the frame. So this.
So you were doing single frame edits onto a 1-inch machine, or?
Yeah, it was actually a BVH 2500, which was a Sony machine that was designed to do animation, and it pretty much worked. But what it was is when you get into the geometry of how helical scan videotape machines work, but when the tape is moving forward through the machine during normal playback, the heads are making this diagonal stripe across the tape.
Yep.
When the tape is not moving, the forward motion of the tape is not accumulating, so the track of the head across the tape is at a different angle to the tape. So what the Sony did was had a machine that had the tape head on this little piezoelectric crystal that would move the head sideways, vibrate it sideways at the proper speed and rate to compensate for that, so you could record a single frame while the tape was not moving.
Oh, wow.
And so it was able to record a frame in about a third of a second and then bring the next frame. And so it was about half a second to 3/4 of a second per frame to do that. And that worked pretty well. The tape that came out of that was, we had to go through a time-based corrector in order to look good, but it worked okay.
I feel so spoilt. I came along in the days of abacuses, and we had, the ability to play out 30 seconds of memory, and in one burst, it was piece of cake.
You young kids have got it easy. Let me tell you, back in my day, geez, recording animation was the giantest pain on earth until you could just play it back now off a computer. But actually, the videotape machine was easy. That was luxury compared to doing it on film. For God's sakes, doing the Voyager animations and the Cosmos animations were all done on 16mm movie film, and that was a real pain because we had to set up a camera on a tripod aimed at the CRT, and very carefully arrange it so that things centered properly. And then we had an animation camera set up so it would thread up the film and turn off all the lights in the room, lock the door, go across the hall and control the thing. Or actually, I usually stayed in the room with it and slap the tape, a digital tape of the pre-calculated frames up on a 9-track tape drive, and run a program, puts in a loop, and haul in the frame, click the shutter, haul in another frame, click the shutter, haul in another frame, click the shutter. And it would take between 8 or 10 hours of this to record the entire Voyager flyby animation. And then you had to go and get the film developed and hope to God that you had the exposure right.
And hope to God that someone then didn't lose the negative when you handed it over to the PR department.
Yeah, right. And, right. And so the nice thing about the videotape thing was you could record it, the thing, and you could still do insert edits if you needed to fix a frame. If there was a little bad section there that you didn't like, you'd go through and overwrite that with insert edits to change bad frames. I mean, that was one of the things that I did for Cosmos was this DNA replication sequence, which was also a god-awful nightmare. It was like 2 or 3 weeks worth of round-the-clock calculation once we had even got the thing done. And so see exactly what's going on. I was recording that, and it was going in there, and it would, on film, it would click the frame, read a frame off the tape, click the frame, and so forth. These are all pre-calculated. And I was just watching it, and a bad frame came up. And I just hit the interrupt button quick enough so that it hadn't clicked the frame at the time. I caught the camera before it clicked that frame, and I looked at the bad frame and realized the next 20 frames were garbled for some reason or other. So I had to go back to the code while the camera was still sitting there, figure out what I had done wrong, fix the bug in the software, recalculate those 20 or 30 frames, which took an hour or two, kind of put those back in there, and essentially, digitally switch over to the new frames and clicked off those 20 frames on the camera, and then switch back to the tape to do the old one. And that was, hair-raising experience.
How closely were you actually working with Carl Sagan himself on the Cosmos series?
Oh, not incredibly closely. He came by several times to talk about ideas that they wanted and so forth, and a lot of it was through the producer named Greg Andorfer, I guess, was kind of like the day-to-day contact, and also some of the artists who did the artwork that we started with to digitize and animate. I worked with John Lomberg a bit, but I met with him several times, and he was, really happy with the stuff we were doing. I got a nice letter from him thanking me for my. It was funny. It was the letter he sent me says, "Dear Jim, I would like to tell you that when I first read it, I thought he said, I've lost admiration for your work." And I thought, what? And I read it again. He said, I am lost in your admiration for your work. So I just read it wrong the first time.
When you get to the Mathematica project, or the Project Mathematics, as I think it was renamed, I'm sure I've seen you in the footage of that, though it was uncredited, playing the trombone. Was that you playing the trombone?
Yeah, that was me.
Are you a musician?
Very, very amateur. I played the trombone since junior high school, off and on, and enjoyed it, but I'm not particularly good at it. But I was in the Caltech wind ensemble, which Caltech, being mostly a technical school, doesn't like have a big arts program, but they have several bands. They had a jazz band and a wind ensemble, and various other things like that. And because Caltech is not a big place, the bands are sort of open to faculty members as well as students, and also other people in the community that want to come by and just have fun playing in a band. And so all of the parts of the music are filled out and so forth. And so for the the 20 years I was at Caltech, I was in the wind ensemble or the jazz band, and got to be friends with the director and so forth. And when we had this program on sines and cosines, one of the examples was Fourier synthesis and how you can build up different wave shapes. I thought it would be cool to show what the wave shape of different instruments would be, and so we got the wind ensemble to cooperate with us, and we filmed them playing in a group, and got several different single instruments to come and play a sample tone into a microphone, which we digitized. And this is what a clarinet sounds like. This is what a flute sounds like. This is what a trombone sounds like. And so that worked out quite nicely.
So if I can, I want to shift gears from your work as an educator to some of your relationships with the industry, especially with SIGGRAPH. And obviously the film industry runs in parallel with SIGGRAPH in many respects, has changed a little bit over the years, but always there's been a great relationship between the academic community and the film community. And one of the great laws of that film community is Blinn's law of the paradox of efficiency. Do you want to explain what that is and when you came up with it? the idea of technology advances, the render time remains constant?
Basically, yeah. Well, it was an observation that I made, and that, as the computers get faster, then the appetite of the artist gets bigger. And so, frames always take between 5 and 10 minutes to make, although maybe they're more like an hour to make for some of them nowadays. But it's more an observation of it's kind of like how patient you are to wait for the image. And 5 to 10 minutes a frame is about all you can stand to wait to do an animation. And so when it was simple pictures for 5 to 8 minutes a frame, that's what you made. When it was complicated pictures, you could make complicated ones, then you were able to wait 5 or 10 minutes per frame, and you made more complicated pictures.
In your bright shiny future 2000 article, looking forward to 2020, you predicted a bunch of stuff that was things you wanted to see happen. So maybe not so much just specific problems in computer graphics you want to solve, but you predicted a bunch of stuff partly in the paper, you said, because you reckon they were already happening. And some of them were sort of more mathematical, like the end of linear maths on gamma-corrected signals. And I hope we've got far enough now that one can be ticked off the list, at least in almost most circumstances. And you also mentioned things like flat screens. You kind of predicted iPads, which I thought was interesting. There are a couple of other things that are in there that are more esoteric that I wanted to get your opinion on. One of them was the idea of content being stored as the database to be rendered rather than the pixel rendering itself. Could you explain that concept?
It's more the idea of rather than rendering the thing into pixels for playback, having the original database rendering the stuff in real time as you're watching it, which is basically what happens in computer games now. The cutscenes and so forth might sometimes be pre-rendered, but a lot of times in computer games, even cutscenes are use the game engine to render it on the fly. And so, in a sense, that's it's using the real-time rendering capabilities of whatever system you've got to rather than playback pre-canned frames, just have the computer models in there and the animation database for how they move, and just re-render it as you're watching it instead of watching static frames. That way, you can do some adjustments to the viewpoint after the fact and whatnot. So computer games to a large extent are doing a lot of that nowadays.
Well, now we're 12 years into that cycle between your 2000 and 2012, and one of the other things that you mentioned is you sort of hate the use, or you said then, you hated the use of special purpose graphics hardware. You wanted everything to be on the CPU. But that idea of the gaming engine is pretty much living and breathing because of GPU. Do you still have an opinion that you want to see things move away from a graphics processor to a general purpose CPU?
Well, depends what you call a graphics processor versus a general CPU. Graphics processors are getting more and more general, and in fact, they become more like CPUs, but designed for parallelism more. The graphics processors at the time I was writing were just a bitch to program, and they did just one thing. And sometimes when you're experimenting with new ways of rendering things or new ways of doing lighting and so forth, you would like to have a little more freedom to play around with the mathematics and try stuff out, and going beyond what the graphics processor had burned into the silicon. But since that time, the whole idea of programmable, graphics pipelines, shader programming is the term I'm looking for. That was not very current at the time, as I believe, and now shader programming is a big step in that direction. Is basically you can write shaders to do whatever arithmetic you want and get much more flexibility and much more easy to program than you could at the time.
In that article, you also predicted what would become Google's massive book project in terms of digitizing, the world's media and having it in digital form. But I guess the essence of that article was just how optimistic you were about the future, this idea that of a bright, shiny future. And the question that you asked in that paper is, why does the future always have to be rusty?
Yeah.
Do you still optimistic looking forward? I hope so.
Hard to say. I think the future is going to be a lot better than what most movies portray it as being. The whole genre of science fiction and futuristic programs movies tends to all be dystopian, which is pretty depressing. And I'm hoping that the future can be fun again, and not the some horrible political oppressive political regime or robots taking over or something like that. The future should be a fun place to aspire to be.
You ended up going to Microsoft and becoming a fellow there, where Dr. Alviera Smith was also a fellow. You've left Microsoft. What are you doing at the moment? You mentioned you're writing. Is that an autobiography? Or what are you doing?
Yeah, I'm working on some autobiographical writing. Basically, going back, looking at some of what we've discussed today. How I got to get to the Mechanical Universe Project and the various kind of lucky breaks I found along the way, and also sort of interested in writing up sort of what the world was like in various eras of my experience. Like I just described, what was it like to have to record animation on a movie camera, and what was it like to have to use a IBM card sorter in order to plot histograms of physics data, which is what I started out doing. The sort of history of technology.
I think we're going to have to. I think we're going to have to explain that, because I actually know what a card reader is, because I once punched out little bits to try and get a program to run on a card reader. But I mean, most people don't even know what a card reader is. Do you want to explain what that was that you just referred to?
Well, back in the old days, the main way of feeding input to computers was on punch cards, which were about 3 by 6 inch rectangles of cardboard. And you punched holes in them with a particular machine. Different patterns of holes would stand for different letters and numbers. There typically was like 80 columns across and 12 rows of holes. And you would punch out your program, for example, on the cards, one line per card, and the stack of cards that each card was a separate line in the program that you would feed into the computer in the card reader, and it would read it in and execute the program. But in addition to using punch cards for computer input, they were originally designed to do the United States Census in, I think, 1900. And there are a whole bunch of machines that would just do various simple operations on the cards without using a computer. For example, you could have a card sorter, which is what we had in the physics department at Michigan when I was there, that you would set a little dial saying which column that you wanted to sort on, and it had 10 little slots, and you would feed the cards in one end, and it would read the thing in, and depending on which number was punched in that column, it would put it in that particular slot. So all the cards that had a 1 punched in it would go in slot number 1. Cards that had a 2 punch in would go in slot number 2, and so forth. And you could sort your cards in numerical order this way using this mechanical device. It wasn't really a computer at all.
It's funny, because in a way, that idea of how you encode the data, in this case physically in cards, is something that you return to time and time again, in the sense that you got heavily involved in discussions on mathematical notation. And I want to segue into that, if I can, just to finish up, because we mentioned that you're possibly writing an autobiography or autobiographical material, but you've published many books, though normally by collections of columns that you did from the original Jim Blinn's Corner.
Right, yeah.
And as I say, one of the ones that I really loved was a piece you published about notation. I think it was in the 3rd book, where you basically just discussed the nature of how we have scientific or mathematical notation. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's kind of become my obsession too these days. I've always had a tough time understanding mathematics from mathematicians, and because I just kind of think of it in a different way than mathematicians do, I guess. And one of the main things that computer graphics does is, model shapes with mathematical equations, and all this, bicubic patch modeling and so forth that like the teapot was made out of. And I became more and more interested in how mathematicians have studied the relationship between an algebraic equation and the geometric shape it represents. over the years. And a lot of this was done by about 100 years ago. But if you read the mathematics papers, it's really hard to understand what the heck they're talking about, at least to me. And so I've been playing around with a mathematical notation technique that makes a lot of this, I think, a lot easier to understand, and kind of translating a lot of these old papers into this notational technique to see if I can make it a lot easier to figure out how you see the relationship between what equation you've got and the shape that it represents. Yeah, one of the things I'm hoping to do in the biographical writing is talk more about University of Michigan too, because a lot of good stuff was done there, and it hasn't been publicized very much. A lot of times you read computer history, and it's like, oh, Stanford did this, MIT did that, Utah did so and so, and so forth. But I was at University of Michigan for almost 8 years, 4 years as an undergraduate, 2 years as a graduate student, and 2 years afterwards as a just an employee in the computing center. And a lot of cool stuff was done there, and that also was a good hotbed of getting my skill level to the proper point that when I went to Utah, I could walk in and finish a PhD in 2.5 years with a bunch of new stuff in it because I already knew the background.
I must admit, I was ignorant of University of Michigan as being a significant computer graphics contributor, and I try to research these interviews as thoroughly as I can. So I guess
that's why biographical writing is interesting to me. University of Michigan, Jim Foley was a graduate student there who co-wrote the Foley and Van Dam textbook.
Yep.
And also Bill Joy was an undergraduate there when I was there. Went and started Sun. And he, in fact, was a student in one of the courses that I taught.
It's it is just really hard to piece together some of this history, yet it's so important that we kind of have an accurate. It's funny because we still have the luxury of being able to speak to most of the people, and so it's a great time to make sure we can get this right.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a lot of different things going on in different places, and some of them have gotten written up and others haven't. And I know there's probably a lot of other universities where cool stuff was done that, since I wasn't there, I don't know about it, but I'm going to try to write up the Michigan part of it that I was experiencing, at least.
In the original Teapot paper, I forgot to ask you this at the time, the one that was published from the University of Utah that you co-authored, who is the woman in the shot that you're texture mapping onto?
God, if I know.
Okay.
That was originally a picture that I got from a friend at Michigan. One of the other graduate students there was doing a thesis on image processing or something like that, and he got that picture, I guess, from somebody at MIT as a sample image to do his experiments with, and I got a copy of it with me that I brought with me to Utah as just a sample image to do things with. And so when I was looking for things to, what else can we plaster onto a teapot, I said, oh, here's a picture of this human face, let's try that out, and there it is. And so I don't know who it was originally.
I must admit, I love that original paper because the teapot seems to have the right aspect ratio. It's so often reproduced squashed in it's, seems a shame that the most historical model
I don't remember if that was the squashed version. I thought that was the squashed version that was in the paper.
Oh, I thought it looked pretty unsquashed, but maybe I'm wrong. But it
I'll have to take a look. I don't know if you heard the story about that, but the original teapot that Martin, digitized that was in his thesis was, taller.
Yeah.
And we had that kind of ultimately transformed to be in the picture system program. When Martin did it, was just on a Tektronix storage tube display, so it wasn't able to rotate it in real time or anything like that. But we took the data and put it on a picture system, just playing around with it, and we. I guess we were demonstrating to somebody, and we said, and also you can, change the vertical scale. And so we, turned the knob and made the thing 3/4 as tall or something like that. And for some reason or other, we decided to save that database and kind of thought that it looked better that way. And so that's the version that I use from then on.
It's the most iconic thing that we've ever had. I think I don't know who did it. I remember somebody did a SIGGRAPH paper, one of the 6 fundamental shapes of computer graphics. It was and included the teapot.
Teapotahedron, yeah, that was. So yeah, it's actually a rendering primitive in, I don't know if it's in DirectX or in OpenGL.
Because in many respects, there's it's almost like if you're in maths, you know the secret codes. The secret codes being that different types of letters, different capitalizations, different even like Greek letters or something else tend to represent different things. So if you don't know that, that's fine. But if you do know it, then it makes perfect sense that X, Y, and Z is, at that end of the alphabet we're talking about coordinates. At the other end of the alphabet we're probably talking about variables with A, B, or C. And if we put
exactly
a Greek letter,
there's a lot of subtlety in the mathematical notation that you've kind of learned by osmosis. I guess the AMS might have some standards for mathematical notation. Maybe Donald Knuth's TEX, TEX spelling program probably contributed to that as well, trying to standardize some of the mathematical usage.
It does seem to me that that's the bridge that we've yet to build in, say, an organization like SIGGRAPH, in that quite often I'll go to a paper or hear of a paper and the maths will be almost a wall for me entering it, and I've got a degree in pure maths, and yet sometime later I'll realize that the paper is significant, and I'll go back and kind of wade through the maths, and then I'll make sense of what's going on, and then there's a sort of aha moment where you start to sort of piece it all together. But it's not an easy bridge to cross between looking at a SIGGRAPH paper in the proceedings and then appreciating the subtleties of what might be a really great algorithmic advance. Would you agree?
Yeah. It's there's always this disconnect sometimes between people who invent something and being able to communicate it to someone else. And somebody who has a good skill at inventing things doesn't necessarily have a good skill at communicating it, and it has to have sat around and been sort of redescribed by other people several times before a wider audience can follow along.
So, are you still going to be doing educational work? And what's your relationship these days with SIGGRAPH? I remember seeing you, I think, last when you were down the front of the computer graphics animation theatre playing a very elaborate computer game on a very large basis.
Yeah, I primarily my contributions these days will be through, I guess, through my website, which is barely functional at this point. But I'm hoping to put all my mathematical and historical musings up on that, and that'll be the primary way that I'm able to communicate it to the outside world these days.
What's the URL for that?
JimBlinn.com.
Excellent. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking time to talk to us and walking through some of these issues. It's been a great honor to talk to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that was great, Mike, and thanks to Dr. Blinn for speaking with us for such a long time. That was I truly, the bookend of that with the Dr. Avi Ray Smith is great stuff. I'm anxious to hear what you find, where you go next with this series.
Me too. Well, thanks so much, Jeff, and thank you guys for listening. We appreciate it.
All right, before we close out, I'd like to thank our FX Insider members who support the site through their contributions. As a thanks for donations made as part of the FX Insider program, we give you access to exclusive additional content, things like member-only articles, additional FX breakdowns, and more. You can find details over at fxguide.com and then click the FX Insider tab. In addition to the FX podcast, which you've been listening to, we do 2 other regular audio podcasts. First, the VFX Show, which reviews visual effects and current releases as well as classic films. And then the RC podcast covers the ever-changing landscape of digital cinematography. We'd also recommend our HD video podcast, FX Guide TV. And check out our sister site, fxphd.com, that offers extensive online visual effects training. Well, that'll do it for this FX podcast. For my partners, Mike Seymour and John Montgomery, we'll see you on the next FX podcast.
Please let us know if you have any suggestions for stories or future podcasts. You can reach us by clicking the Contact Us link at the top of the homepage. This podcast is copyright FX Guide, LLC. Broadcast or redistribution is prohibited without the expressed written consent of FX Guide.